All right. Hi, everyone. Phil Travis here, EOU. So today's lesson, or this week's lesson, I should say, we're going to be talking about the year 1860 that you're going to be reading about, of course, in the McPherson text. This, obviously, 1860, 1859, and 1860 was obviously a critical moment in the lead up to the Civil War. Obvious because the Civil War occurred at the beginning of 1861, basically. So there's some very important factors that heighten tensions and increase sectionalism in the country that enhance the deterioration. So the first thing I wanted to talk a little bit about is the historiography of slavery. So how historiography is, obviously the study of history, how historians have documented the practice of slavery in the United States over time. History is always changing. We hope we come to the best interpretations, and that the best interpretations are good enough to stand the test of time. But generally speaking, history is a practice of reinterpreting things as we learn more through documents, through new perspectives and things like this. And so I wanted to briefly explain how history has changed on the issue of slavery since the beginning of the modern professional discipline of history. Slavery and Southern slave owners were initially treated in a very apologetic light by original historians in the early 20th century, particularly Ehrlich Phillips, who wrote on this topic in the early 20th century. Phillips, he's a Southern apologist and a slavery apologist, and that means that he casts the institution and the slave owners in a far more forgiving light than is done today. Phillips asserted basically that slave owners were honorable Southern men who cared for their slaves and gave them stability and education or training as they moved towards civilization. Phillips assumed that slaves were like children, that they were unable to act for themselves, and that they willingly and happily accepted the control and direction of benevolent Southern slave owners who knew better and uplifted Southern honor. So it's a very, very apologetic way of interpreting the slave institution in the South that ultimately contributed significantly to the Civil War. And of course, Phillips is writing in the early 20th century, and so it's got to be remembered that historians, the way that historians write sometimes is dictated by the times in which they live. And of course, as a historian, you want to seek to write the most objective and unbiased work that you can. You want to seek to use documents in the best possible way to tell the most objective and clear and precise history that is possible. That is not always the case, and certainly Phillips' history is not accurate. It's very wanting in that respect. And he was largely a product, I would say, of the early 20th century, a period in which Americans were, as a country, increasingly grounded by racial perspectives. The Ku Klux Klan during this period rose to unprecedented, its largest membership numbers. The government passed immigration laws that effectively barred immigration to the country from, quote unquote, non-white areas. A Birth of a Nation, which was a film that really glorified the KKK during the Civil War period, was accepted favorably in the United States. And so Phillips, I think, reflects that atmosphere. Since the 1960s, and really beginning in the late 50s, you have seen many historians refute Phillips over and over again. And these historians have had their own internal arguments about other aspects. But generally speaking, scholars like Kenneth Stamp, Eugene Genovese, Ira Berlin, many others have increasingly documented that slavery was, that the Southern apologist interpretation is wrong. That slavery was repressive, and that it became increasingly repressive over the 3 centuries where which slavery was in place in North America. Ira Berlin, in her book, in the book, I'm sorry, Ira Berlin in the book, Many Thousands Gone, documents slavery going through 3 phases, from an early phase in which slaves had greater skills and more freedom to ultimately a slave system that was far more domineering and repressive than it was when it began. A system that fundamentally withheld individuals' rights to any kind of education and purposely kept them without education, and broke up families and these kinds of things. Slave historiography has, in the present time, since the 1960s really, accepted that slaves were not acted upon. They were not merely acted upon. They were not like children. They were agents. They created a unique culture themselves, and they were constantly resisting bondage. And so we have really, in the last 50, 60 years, have really reinterpreted the historiography of slavery, and resoundingly accepted by scholars is that the slave institution was repressive, and that it was not in any way, shape, or form some kind of acceptable institution, that it was something that was based on exploitation and based on a brutal repression of individual freedom. And so we've really changed a lot over the last 130 years or so in how we look at the South, and how we look at, or the Confederacy, perhaps I should say, how we look at the institution of slavery in the South, in the United States, and how we consider that when we look at this period. So, in the lead up to the election of 1860, you had a case for the Democrats in which the Democrats were increasingly divided, and a lot of this came down to the crisis with Kansas, in which you had Southern Democrats who insisted Kansas has got to be slave, right? That Southerners said, Stephen Douglas, you promised us that Kansas would be a slave state, and this has got to be a slave state. But as we, talked about last week, increasingly Kansas was being populated by more people that were anti-slavery. And of course, Stephen Douglas's doctrine, the so-called Freeport Doctrine, was that popular sovereignty should reign, that the state should be determined by the will of the people. Well, that crisis really created a divide in the Democrat Party, between Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats. And this really plays out at the conventions that are held. There's 2 conventions, as we'll see just in a moment. So Southern Democrats, really what they seek now is really a complete repudiation of any attempts at preventing slavery's expansion, as well as popular sovereignty. They don't want to have a situation come about in which a state could become free and, make it illegal for a slave owner to possess a slave in that territory, for example. They believe that there should be a slave code. These are Southern Democrats. They believe there should be a slave code system that will basically protect slave owners and their property anywhere in the country. Southerners saw slaves as property, and in this respect, they saw it as something that should be just simply protected, that any move by the United States to not just outright protect their property rights incensed them to significant anger at this time. By contrast to the Southern Democrats, who, the Southern Democrats want a complete repudiation of any attempt to prevent slavery's expansion and any attempt to use popular sovereignty in the territories. They want a slave code platform in the territories. By contrast, Northern Democrats, who were really led by Stephen Douglas from Illinois, they supported the Freeport Doctrine, which advocated popular sovereignty. And this is a fundamental divide between Democrats, Northern and Southern Democrats. And as you see, it is really the thing, it's the really undoing of the Democratic Party. So another factor in the lead up to these elections and raising tensions, increasing animosities north and south, of course, was John Brown's raid. Yes, this is the same John Brown as the one who launched the Potawatomi Massacre. John Brown had attempted to, excuse me, John Brown in 1859 attempted to incite a slave rebellion in the South, particularly in Virginia. And he began this by cobbling together a handful of individuals in the teens. Many of them didn't show up. He tried to get Frederick Douglass, actually, to join him in this move to incite a rebellion, which was really, it was not a very likely event to happen. There was no broad level unity of the rebellion that he sought to incite. He basically just kind of imagined that his handful of people would attack the garrison at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and they would take the weapons, and they would then use the weapons and distribute them to slaves who would then revolt. But it wasn't in any way, shape, or form a reasonable kind of plan. And Frederick Douglass described it as a suicide mission, and of course he would not have anything to do with the campaign. Brown, of course, launches his rebellion, and of course he's captured and he's put down. He's put down by the forces of Robert E. Lee. Afterwards, of course, Brown is put on trial, and his trial becomes a spark for these sectional tensions between North and South, as Southerners are incensed. On one respect, Southerners are absolutely incensed that a Northern individual is trying to undermine their institutions. And any kind of commentary from the North that did not just simply repudiate any and all such action, Southerners took as a complete and total dishonor to the South and to Southern institutions. By contrast, Brown gave a famous final speech in court where he appealed to the morality of God, basically. And in the North, as you see, here in this piece, in this little newspaper heading, John Brown really becomes a martyr for many. He will be put to death, of course. And he becomes a martyr for the cause, and people hearing his appeal to his religiosity, he builds up a tremendous amount of support from people who I probably would not have otherwise supported John Brown, who was, a little bit less than rational in his thought processes. Here's a look at John Brown. This is 1859. John Brown would be executed in December of 1859. And his execution was very much, it's been criticized by historians for being a mistake, his execution, because the South putting him to death made him a martyr, and it encouraged people to increasingly, rally towards the cause of what is developing into the Civil War, increasing the tensions in the country. Many slave owners, too, even though they were shocked by Brown's action, took it as some kind of verification that, the slaves in the South were happy and well cared for, and that the North must stop these incessant threats upon its peculiar institution, as some had called it. So Southerners, in some cases, were increasingly moved to support of their slave system and to justify their slave system by this action. The election of 1860, of course, is, the fateful election that will lead to war, really. And it was partly brought about, really, because the Democrats became themselves really a sectional party. as the party divided, with Northern Democrats being one faction, Southern Democrats becoming another faction. There were two conventions, and it's important to remember that at this time, political conventions at this time really decided who was going to be your candidate and really decided what the platform of your party would be. And this is very different than what we see today. We are very used to, today in the modern world, we're very used to party platforms being established kind of well in advance, and we're very used to basically knowing exactly who the nominee will be long before the convention ever happens. It wasn't like this at this time. Conventions were really places where parties got together, they selected candidates, candidates campaigned for their selections, and they formed their platforms, and they voted on the basis of their platforms. And so the Democrats have a real problem. They can't get together. They cannot agree. They first met in Charleston, and the convention failed to produce a nominee. They then meet in Baltimore, and in Baltimore, the convention will again really fail to produce a true single-party nominee. Both conventions in Charleston and Baltimore experienced bolters, and these were people who were walking out in protest of support for Stephen Douglas and his idea of popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats, who will ultimately nominate John C. Breckinridge, which you see pictured here on the campaign poster. He was vice president with James Buchanan, the Democrat from Pennsylvania. Southern Democrats are going to nominate Breckinridge as a alternative candidate and on a slave code platform. The Southern Democrats really insisted on an all or nothing thing. They were not going to accept popular sovereignty. They saw Stephen Douglas's popular sovereignty program as facilitating increasing free states. They wanted to assure that that slavery effectively was universally protected throughout the Union, in the territories at least. And so this leads to a break-off party that forms this, it's the Democrats, but the Southern Democrat portion that forms a slave code platform. By contrast, Northern Democrats nominate Stephen Douglas in Baltimore on a platform of uplifting the position of popular sovereignty. They were fundamentally divided over this issue. So the Republicans held their convention in Chicago, and the Republicans were really a sectional party that was cobbled together from, the remnants of a number of different parties, from Whigs to Free Soilers, and so forth. And even though William Seward, who would be Lincoln's Secretary of State ultimately, William Seward was really the front runner in the at the convention. Lincoln was kind of not as well known, but Lincoln ultimately does emerge as the ideal candidate. Lincoln had come to some fame in the Lincoln-Douglas debates, as you see depicted on this stamp here. And the North, or the Republicans, I should say, knew that they, in order to win the election, they needed to carry the North. They had to win all of the northern states. That meant unifying northern Republicans and lower North Republicans. So they felt that Lincoln was the ideal candidate to do that. The Republicans really can't run in the South, and they know that in order to win this election, they have to carry the North. The Democrats are divided, and the Republican candidate, Lincoln, will actually not even make it on the ballot in 10 southern states. They really couldn't campaign there. You risked being tarred and feathered and run out of town on a rail in the South, and so it was not safe in the South for Republicans. Lincoln was widely opposed before the election, and so campaigning in the South and actually winning southern states was just not an option for the Republicans, and Lincoln becomes the ideal candidate to unify the North. The Republican platform, in a nutshell, Lincoln's position with the slavery issue was really that slavery should not be allowed to expand. Lincoln would pretty steadfastly assert, and this includes after his election and before the war begins, that his position would be to not allow the institution of slavery to expand. And before the beginning of the war, Lincoln would make promises to not interfere with slavery in the current places that it was located in the South, but that it was integral that slavery not be allowed to expand. Lincoln was deeply fearful of becoming a slave empire. He felt that slavery, was a antiquated system that had to be ultimately it had to be allowed to die out effectively. And so Lincoln would pledge not to allow slavery to expand in the Union. There was also the Constitutional Party, which nominated the fourth candidate for the election, and they nominated John Bell. The Constitutional Party was sometimes, referred to as sort of an old man's party, and it was particularly popular in places like Virginia. And the Constitutional Party it really didn't have a platform. They basically ran on a resolution to effectively do nothing about the slavery question, to effectively pretend that we're just not even gonna address the slavery question. And this was actually an issue for everybody involved. Republicans, of course, Republicans wanted to prevent the expansion of slavery in the new territories. Stephen Douglas and the Northern Democrats wanted to promote popular sovereignty in the new territories. And of course, Southern Democrats behind Breckinridge wanted to promote effectively a slave code in the Western territories, meaning that there would be no restrictions against the movements of slaves through the Western territories, whether through popular sovereignty or through federal law. So that kind of sets up where the election was at, with Lincoln a sectional candidate, the Democrats divided, and a kind of middle constitutional party that becomes an option for many in the upper South, places like Virginia, for example. It's a political cartoon, kind of ridiculing Lincoln and his anti-slavery stance. His vice presidential running mate was Hannibal Hamlin. So this is a political cartoon from the time. You can see the racism in this political cartoon, and also how it's ridiculing Lincoln for his stance on slavery, especially amid increasing threats from the South to secede if he's elected. Stephen Douglas, though he doesn't obviously win the presidential election, Stephen Douglas kind of emerged during these political campaigns as a real strong unionist, and somebody who really gave the last year of his life to trying to prevent the country from falling apart. Stephen Douglas really broke from tradition, and he went on a national speaking tour, and he stumped all over the North, all over the South. Douglas, and see, that's the thing, is that at this time, not only do we have conventions deciding platforms and conventions establishing candidates, rather than being more the formality day, in the same respect, the candidates themselves often did not do the most of the speaking. There were some 50,000 speeches given in support of Lincoln. Lincoln gave very few of them. They were actually people that support him, local politicians, people who support him. And so you would build up your support not as much by going about and directly speaking, but by having other people do that, for you in far-off areas. Stephen Douglas kind of broke from that precedent, and he went on his own speaking tour. He was in ill health. His voice was raspy. He had some health problems at this time, but nonetheless, he went to great lengths and through great exhaustion to stump and promote himself as a national candidate, promote the idea of popular sovereignty as he had, the idea that people should be able to decide in a democracy in the new territories whether they should be free or they should be slave. Ultimately, Douglas realizes that he's not going to be able to win. He realizes that the South is kind of all or nothing They want a slave code platform. They oppose popular sovereignty. He also realizes that he can't carry the North. When Douglas realizes that Lincoln effectively is going to win, he goes to the South and he pleads with Southerners to not secede on the basis of an election, saying that it's basically it's you know it's not constitutional in his view to secede because of an election. But Stephen Douglas is really not going to be, his concerns are not going to be heeded, obviously. You know, I also say this, and McPherson talks about this, but the Southerners were threatening to secede, if Lincoln were elected. But what really could Lincoln do? Could Lincoln, should he have, I suppose the Republicans could have just completely eliminated their party, and Lincoln could have never run for the presidency. But that's a little bit, how could you expect? That's not a reasonable, kind of position to take. And so it was kind of an ultimatum. It was kind of an all or nothing from a lot of elements in the Deep South. Of course, Lincoln's election, Lincoln does win the election. He doesn't win a landslide or anything. He wins really by default. And of course, he'll win another election during the war in 1864. But he really wins by default. I mean, the Republicans did what they needed to do. They carried the North, and that was what they intended to do, and that was enough to win the election. But Lincoln's not listed on 10 states in the South. He received, in the states he was listed in, he received virtually no votes. So he basically wins a northern vote. It's a sectional vote, and the South, the Deep South particularly, had protested his candidacy, and so he really wins because the Democrats had divided themselves between Stephen Douglas and Breckinridge, between a popular sovereignty stance, a northern popular sovereignty stance, and a southern slave code stance. The Constitutional Party of Bell had also, really not helped Democrats. So as those were the states in Virginia, and North Carolina, and Tennessee, and these states ultimately went for Bell. And so this obviously hurt the Democrats as well. And so Lincoln kind of wins by default. He wins on a northern vote, and he wins largely because of the fragmentation of the Democratic Party. After his election, state by state, Deep South states began calling up conventions to secede. South Carolina took the lead, hoping that their lead would inspire others. And February 1st, South Carolina seceded, and ultimately 7 Deep South states, the ones pictured in blue on this map, all seceded from the Union. On February 4th, Jefferson Davis is made president of the Confederate States. Now the border states, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, the middle states that had not seceded yet, the border states are the ones in green: Delaware, Maryland, Arkansas, and Kentucky. Missouri and Kentucky. But the 4 states that had not seceded, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, they were on the fence, and it wasn't clear that these states were going to secede until violence erupts when the South besieges the Union garrison outside of Charleston at Fort Sumter. And we will talk about that in our next lesson. All right, guys, I hope that's helpful, and let me know if you have any questions.